Colleagues, my presentation is basically predicated on two or three assumptions. One is that we can't continue to do what we always did because it used to work and we have to change. One is driven by this, which I said I'd show, and I know you won't be able to see it much, but you've just got to look at the green and the brown. So this is the rainfall change from 1960 through to the present day. And this is when it's looking at 1970 to the present day, like that. Now all these brown bits have got anything up to 50 millimetres less rain, and any of the dark green bits have got up to 50 millimetres more rain. So I probably want to argue that what that's telling us is, and assuming these are the latest data from the Bureau of Meteorology, assuming that what that's telling us is that this is just an inexorable shift that we're seeing in Australia, with a overall shift in the temperature of around about 0.6, 0.7 of a degree over a similar time period and so on. That what we used to do, we can't continue to do in the way that we used to do it, or even tinker at the margins in order to get a little bit more productivity out of some of the land that we presently use. One of the things that we have to remember in Australia is that the projected population by 2050 will be something to the order of 47 million people. And that means that unless things change dramatically, our big cities, especially Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, will just get bigger. And when you look at where some of that agricultural land is that's still productive, then it's adjacent to Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. And so we will chew up available agricultural land through growing cities. We will shift the character of our agricultural production because of change of rainfall patterns. And I suggest that the third potential, anyway, big disruption is the trade agreements that are presently being signed. Now, as I said earlier, one of the issues that I heard this morning, and I haven't looked at them, but one of the issues that I heard this morning was increasing agricultural exports to Japan and South Korea, and a increase in the number of jobs in the agricultural sector. So we have to presume that that means that a lot of those trade agreements are predicated upon the assumption of more product and not just more of the same, or redirecting as as I said earlier. So I think these do present some great challenges to us. I think the disappointing thing is that productivity gains within agriculture increased by around about 2% per annum in the 3 decades up to the year 2000, and then it flatlined. And I don't know why that is, but I can't imagine that we could be happy that it has. Because when you look at the shift in rainfall, when you look at the shift in temperature, with some things more sensitive to temperature than others, including human beings, when you look at what pressures will be introduced, even if there are lots of benefits from the trade agreements, and I'm certainly not opposing that, or those, but there will be pressures if we are to meet them. Now, they're not mandated. Nobody's going to come along to you and say, you have to sell your product to Japan or to Korea, South Korea. But if we want to be in the game, then we're going to have to meet some of the implicit obligations that come out of those trade negotiations. So we're shifting, I think, from a position where we did enjoy increased productivity over the latter half of the 20th century. And I guess that it's simply a fact to say that it is unlikely, extremely unlikely, that the average weekly earnings in Australia will fall. I can't imagine a government going to an election as they seek a mandate saying we're going to cut the average weekly earnings down to the level of even New Zealand. I just can't see that happening. So it actually means our costs are going to stay high. It means that our productivity is going to increase, and yet it's flatlined over the last decade or so. There are good data that show, and we heard a little earlier about the influence that the CRC has had on a substantial number of farms and farmers. And I think when you get under the surface of all that and you look at the how publicly funded research and development significantly contributed to that increased productivity. And one of the important things about publicly funded research and development, I think, and it is something that we should be pushing much harder than we have to date, and we are, but that is that it's that publicly funded research which helps mitigate the risk that individuals would take were they paying for that R&D themselves. It's what they do in America. In America they talk about it quite differently from here. Business leaders in America will tell the President of the day that it's their job, his job, to invest the patient capital in that basic research that creates the flow of ideas, the flow of knowledge that business can then take up and turn into goods and services that are of interest to them and relevant to them. So I think that the way in which we allocate publicly funded research, and in this area through the RDCs, I think has been, it seems to me anyway, particularly successful. And I would hope that over a period of time we can actually get that to be increased and maybe a little more strategic. We are arguing that we need a complete strategic approach to science and development and research in Australia. I mean, it is a simple fact of life that the number of students enrolled in our universities in agricultural science has dropped substantially over a period of time. And whatever anybody tells you, if it's coming back, it's coming back by 100, not by the numbers that would take it back to what it was like 10 or 15 years ago. So how are we going to do this? I mean, if we've got fewer students studying agricultural science, and it is true that some of those who are studying genetics or whatever might work in agricultural services, but if you look at agricultural science where they cover that broad suite of activities within the degree, then the numbers presenting now are much smaller. And they bottomed out about 2 years ago, but it was much smaller than it had ever been in Australia. There are, and one of the indicators in a sense, is that there are only 585 international students commenced undergraduate courses in agriculture and the environment. So that's an important number because most of the universities know that it's through bringing in these full-paying students from overseas that you can begin to cross-subsidise the things that you want to do within the university. So to compare the 585 international students studying agriculture, how about the 15,000 international students who enrolled in the other, commenced, this is, in the other science, technology and engineering fields? Or even more mind-boggling, how about 45,000 commenced in management and commerce? Or 25,000 in health degrees? So what we're actually seeing is a shift away from the core, the base that we need to do some of the things that you've been talking about and that I heard talked about on the panel. If we're not producing graduates, we're not producing PhD students. If we're not producing PhD students, we're not doing the research. We know that the population of the academic staff in agricultural science departments is going up because even a lot of those students who are studying agricultural science at undergraduate level are not coming through the system and going into research. So one of the issues that is a keen topic of discussion that I have with government is whether we should actually just let the study, the skill profile of our workforce be determined almost exclusively by the study choices of 17-year-old students, or even earlier, when they make their decisions at the end of year 10 to do chemistry, maths and physics or whatever. And if they choose not to, it's actually hard to get across that gap later on. It's possible, but it's hard. So we live in a democracy, people have got choices, they're allowed to make choices. But I suggest that if we're serious about having agriculture as a key element in whatever trade agreements we write with whatever countries, when we look to feed our own population, which is going up by 80-odd%, when we look to contribute to the diets of the world, which is going up to 9 billion people when we can only presently feed 6, up to 9 billion by 2050, then we actually have to intervene. We can't actually say, it'll be okay, because it used to be okay. The world doesn't work like that anymore. America has priorities. The EU has priorities. Britain has priorities. The Germans have priorities.
They all have a focus of their investment in areas where they think they have the capacity in that country to make a difference, and they choose it. And the politicians have got past the sort of nonsense and ours are moving in the right direction, I should say, but they've got past this nonsense about how you can't pick winners. This is not picking a winner, this is picking an area. It's saying agriculture is critically important to our future for the reasons that I've already outlined, and we have to do something about that to make sure that it doesn't drift away and dribble into the sand simply because 17-year-old students are choosing to study economics or something, or commerce or something. So you do actually have to get in there and we have to collectively get in there and make some noise about the fact that some of these priority things that are written over here actually match with what's happening over here. It's relatively, I'm sure it was really tough getting a trade agreement with Japan, but it's relatively easy to put into that things that actually depend on action being taken over here, and there is no connection, or very limited connection. So you heard in the panel a lot about collaboration and cooperation. Let me just remind you that something to the order of 65% of Australia's total researcher capacity is in our universities. 65%. There's about another 15% or so in the publicly funded research agencies, and around about 20% in business. It's the exact opposite in America. It's largely different from where you get most of the Western European democracies, nearly all of which outperform us in terms of scientific endeavour, measured by a variety of parameters. So what are they doing right? What they're actually doing is making sure they do things where they have got a competitive advantage, a national need, and where they think they can make a difference by investing into that area. And we've tended not to do that over the decades, and I think the time when we can simply say, you know, toss 1,000 seeds into the field, I want some red roses, and I hope to God that amongst the 1,000 seeds there are some red roses. They actually put the red roses in the seed packet before they plant them. And if we're not willing to do that, our future is much bleaker than it would need otherwise to be. I think, as I said earlier, there are factors such as climate change, and of course underneath that there is weather variability. There are natural resource constraints and competition for inputs, a lot of which are beyond our control. But what it means is we've just got to be smarter, because if it's going to happen and we want to do the right thing, then surely it is up to us now to take a bit of a run at this and work out how to do what we need to do so that a crunch doesn't happen and all of a sudden, you know, when the rain has moved all the way away, we just say, oh, it's okay, we'll dig up the aquifers. I tell you, when you look at a report that we produced last year, or the four academies produced for us on shale gas, a very significant part of Australia's enormous shale gas reserves sit under the aquifers. It's completely different from coal seam. It's about 3 kilometres down, and nowadays you can drill 3 and across 2, you can frack and you can pull it out. But can you imagine what would happen if all we think that we need to do is pull water out of the aquifers for farming, for agriculture, for irrigation? Some of the water in the Great Artesian Basin is 1 million years old. It's a fossil fuel by another name. So what are we going to do about that? How do we support agriculture in some of the areas, at least some of it's in parts of Australia that I've out there somewhere, but where it's closer to the cities, but where it's certainly closer to a lot of our agricultural productive land. How are we going to make sure we get that right? And I think, as I said, you know, we do have the opportunity to take a run at it, because it's not going to happen tomorrow afternoon. It's not going to happen in 1 year's time. But if you look at those, if you go onto the Bureau of Meteorology site and they add a decade from 1900 to present, 1900, 1910 to present, 1920 to present, and you look at how the rainfall patterns are shifted, I think it's mind-bogglingly frightening. I looked at it and I thought, my God, what are we doing about this? And the short answer is not much. The short answer is we will adjust what we now do because it's not ruinous yet. The question is, can we predict? Do we make an assessment of risk? And do we identify the probability that it might actually move away much more substantially and that we have to do something about it? What are we doing about salt-degraded land? Our salt-degraded land by about 2030 will be up to something like 18% of the presently arable land. It's about the same as in China. So you can imagine that when we sign a trade agreement with China, then agriculture will be a serious part of that too. So providing it for a market that big, with the impact on us of climate and other natural resource constraints, whilst we have no control over it, doesn't mean to say that we do nothing about it. We actually have to do something about it to work to make the transition from one to the other much softer. That does mean getting the research community and the researchers and the agriculture community more generally, government departments and the like, working together in ways that they never have. If you look at the OECD data on Australian business cooperation with universities, we are 33rd out of 33 countries. We are actually one behind Mexico, that's 32. And Mexico is about 2.5 times better at it than we are. Now I know that somebody in this room will say, he doesn't understand, the data are wrong or whatever, we can find another denominator. The point is, it doesn't have to be right to the decimal point. It's a signpost that's saying that we are almost uniquely bad at this. And that signpost is telling us something. Now the British, who have almost the same profile as we have of researchers in universities and industry and so on, they actually have about 50% cooperation by comparison with our 4. Why is that? Don't know. One of the reasons is because they're actually strategic. They have identified where they believe that the UK has the capacity to make a real difference in a world that needs some things where they have competitive advantage. And I think that we're just going to have to do the same and get real about it. One of the things that we've talked about with government now for at least a year is, 2 governments, 3 prime ministers probably, certainly a number of ministers, but we've talked about setting research priorities, basically focused on the US model. There are 2 in there that will interest you, and this is public information. The words that I'm going to use are not the words that are in the document that's gone to the Prime Minister, but food is one. What sort of food and water, food and fibre production do we need? The logistics, the transport logistics. I mean, I don't know whether you know, but about 85% of our freight moves by road. And we import roughly 90+% of our fuel for those trucks. And we have 3 days' supply in the service stations. So you cut 2 of the 3 sea lanes out of Singapore, and what do? There is an argument that we use shale gas. If there is an argument that we use shale gas, then what you have to do is make sure that we're not ruining our agricultural capacity at the same time as we're building up a capacity to ensure that we can get it to market. And that's one of the serious issues that confronts us, I think. So, I'm into discovery. We heard about discovery. The notes I've got here are riddled with good stories about how discovery has been translated by the agricultural sector into products and services. 140% increase in productivity in Australia against a 30-odd% increase in the inputs, labour, land, whatever. I mean, these are big gains, and when you go back and look at how and why, it's because of research. But more importantly, it's research into a community that wanted the research. So they were willing to take it up. Probably not everything. That's some, esoteric bit of research out there that turned on some professor of something or other. Probably not economics, but professor of something or other to do with agriculture. But we never know when that will show a benefit anyway. But in the meantime, we've got huge benefit from the R&D, both in Australia and R&D in Australia, from Australia, that's invested in R&D overseas. Last year I did a little bit of work for ACO, and what was really interesting for me was that as the aid budget was going to increase, but the focus was on many fewer countries, from 97 to about 17 or something, and 2 areas, health and agriculture. Were we ready to do that? How were we going to use that increased budget to invest in agricultural R&D in countries, particularly the 19 aid countries? Kevin Rudd, I think he was Foreign Minister, opened either West Africa or East Africa, can't remember, but a centre that was funded off some of this. There's a lot of interest, of course, in Indonesia and so on about how we would work with them. There's a bit of objection because we might be handing over our IP. The reality is, if we do it right, we get more back than we put there. So it's up to us to get it right. We're supposed to be clever. We're supposed to be really smart at doing what we do. So let's get that right, and let's invest in R&D. I mean, through appropriately safeguarded. Say in Indonesia, which is going to have terrible trouble with its rice crop because of the overuse of pesticides and the like. So how are we going to, do we want a whole lot of hungry Indonesians on our doorstep, or do we want to be a good neighbour and work with them to overcome some of those problems? So I think cooperation between the various sectors, researchers and the rest is important, but I would argue that cooperation internationally is the key. We can't do everything ourselves. We are not big enough to do everything ourselves. We do have to intervene to make sure we maintain capacity, I believe. That's not gross intervention. That's not mandating, saying, oh, you look like a farmer, so you can actually do agricultural science. It's not doing that. It's making agricultural science really attractive for people to want to study it. Make it compellingly interesting for people to want to study it. And the second bit then is to link internationally to help us positioning ourselves in the world, and at the same time being able to bring back intellectual property from our researchers back into Australia to improve our capacity in this country. So, colleagues, a lot of challenges ahead, but they're exciting times. I think there are a lot of things we can do. I hope that we can work with the government to make sure that we do actually begin to focus in on some of the areas that are critically important, given all these other things that are happening out there, as if this bit of the puzzle just followed, and it doesn't. It's got to be worked on to follow. So put it all together, they are exciting times, and put it all together, I think we can do some really good things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chubb, for that summation. Ian Chubb is always thoughtful, he's always thought-provoking, and very often he's provocative, and that's good. That's good. We do need to be provoked, we do need to be challenged, but certainly Ian ended on a very positive note that it is an exciting time. I think the comment that Ian made at the outset, that we can't continue to do what we've always done, is truth of the, or proof of the fallacy of the statement that if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got, because things have changed, and you can't expect the same outcomes from the same actions. And so it is very important that we do actually have a strategy, and Ian made the very significant point that, or I guess it was a challenge, and that is, should we let the skills of Australia's skills profile be determined by the choices of 17-year-old students? And that's something really to think about. And the point being, of course, that we do need to be strategic. We do need to set priorities, and that, I suppose, is really a challenge to all of us. And whenever there's any question about intervention, of course, it does create debates. But as Ian pointed out, our competitors are taking this strategic approach, and it is critical that we do also. So thank you very much for those thought-provoking comments. It's a good point to end the day on, in that we'll go away and think more deeply about the remarks that you've made. So thank you very much, and I'd like the audience just to join me in thanking Ian again. The very last thing before we call it a day is, Ian was talking about the movement of our produce by road. Well, we've got to move some people by the road. So there will be buses leaving for both Ridges and also the Forest Hotel and Apartment immediately. I think there are two buses that are due to go. One was due at 5:30 and one at 5:45, so I'm presuming that those two buses will still be available. The other thing I need to remind you of is that those of you who have registered for the dinner tonight, which is at the Arboretum, the buses will be leaving from the Ridges and Forest Hotel at 6:30 and 6:45. So please be prepared to catch the bus. So to all of you, thank you very much for your participation today. I trust that you found it a very informative and enjoyable event. We've certainly enjoyed the presentation. The last thing I'd like to say is to reiterate the comments that Peter Zazzolo made at the conclusion of the session before afternoon tea. And I'd just like to reiterate that and add one more vote of thanks, if you like, and that is to Peter himself, who's led this team and have been responsible for the leadership of the presentation of today's event. So thank you, Peter. And thank you to everyone else who was part of today. And for those of you who are joining us for dinner tonight, I can assure you we'll have a very enjoyable evening as well. So with that, I'll call to an end Future Farm Live.